Hi there, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, and that is the 6th of October, where we are putting some closure onto short story, moving forward into drama. And one of the things that I talked about last class was writing the critical paper. And in the syllabus and other documents folder, you will find a handout entitled The Critical Paper that was actually given to me when I was an undergraduate student that talks a little bit about some of the criteria to consider when you're writing a paper. And I assume that this is basically review because this is something that you would have discussed in previous English classes. But basically, the idea behind the critical paper is that you spend some time planning, which is what I hope you're doing now, and then writing, and then finally editing, which means that you've left enough time at the end to edit. And the introduction will probably be somewhat challenging because this is where you have your thesis. This is your main point, and you may discover your main point as you are writing, so you might need to plug in the thesis afterwards into your introduction. It's also where you list the author and the text. So after the first paragraph, the reader should be pretty clear about what text you're talking about, who the author is, and what your position happens to be on that text. Your body paragraphs are where you have your evidence and your details. This is where you are including quotation and paraphrase. But remember that you are not summarizing the text, you're analyzing the text. And a paragraph is a developed idea, which means that it's multiple sentences long. Minimum 3 sentences, hopefully a lot longer. And if you're writing paragraphs well, they usually have a topic sentence, the introductory sentence that serves as a kind of summary of that paragraph. So you could read just the opening sentences of a well-written paper, and what you should have is an outline. And then finally, there's a conclusion. This is where you give a sense of closure. And again, you want that to be developed in 3 or more sentences. And you want to make sure that you're adding something that is not a duplication of the introduction, but also that you aren't incorporating new arguments, because those would be in your conclusion. So lots of different ways to do this. Perhaps you could relate at a text or discuss a text that's related to the text you are discussing, or another work by the same author, or perhaps even just compare the text to contemporary day. And then the idea of quotation is what I wanted to focus on today. You can see that in the notes below I had indicated that you could check the previous class where we have some examples of how to go about documenting. We are using the MLA system, the Modern Language Association system, that's devoted to the humanities, and that includes English classes. And basically what that system does is it uses parentheses immediately following a quote, whether you're done with that quote or not. And in those parentheses, you list the least amount of information a reader would need in order to determine where that quote appears. And then the way the system works is that at the very ending of the paper, there's something called a works cited page, where you literally cite or list all of the works that you quoted from or you documented over the course of your paper, and you list them in alphabetical order by author's last name. This is where you give all of the detailed information about all of the texts, whether they be books or websites or magazine articles, whatever. And this is where you give the detail of things like publisher, place of publication, edition, things of that nature. So things are perhaps a little bit easier in our class because we are not doing a research paper, so I'm not asking you to look up outside resources. That said, you're doing a critical paper, which means that you are focusing on the text itself. So in this situation, you don't necessarily have to include a works cited page, because I know very well the work that you are going to be citing is our own text. That said, if you use outside resources, you must add a works cited page. And if you do decide just to practice writing a works cited page, you want to make sure that you're doing it correctly. And the same goes with the documentation within the paper that you would all be doing. You want to make sure that you're doing it correctly. So if you can look down in the notes where I talked about documentation for the MLA, this would be in the notes for the previous class. You use generally punctuation after documentation. So the example I gave you is, quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote. And then I opened parentheses and I put a number, 162, close parentheses, and then I put a period. The 162 is in reference to the page number, 162. Notice I didn't have to write page or PG or P, just the number, and then the punctuation goes after the documentation. If I wasn't done with my sentence could continue on, as you can see with the second example that I've given you. Sentence continuation after documentation. Quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, then I've opened my parentheses, placed the page number, 162, closed the parentheses, and then continued on with my sentence. He cannot pray with his mother, period. Now you can insert yourself into a quote. Usually you do that because you need to clarify something immediately, not because you're doing analysis. It would be comparable to interrupting somebody when they speak. Usually we do it for things like pronouns when you want to clarify who the pronoun is referencing. So for instance, in the example I gave you, insertion, quote, even his, and then you'll see in square brackets the word Krebs's, lies were not sensational, unquote. And then immediately following that is the parentheses, 162, close parentheses, period. Basically, anything in square brackets, no, not parentheses, they're not curved, square brackets, is not part of the original quote. That's your language. So in this instance, the his could reference perhaps either Krebs or his father. So I wanted to clarify by making sure that I gave the name of the pronoun that was replacing the noun, or the noun that was replacing the pronoun, I should say, and that's Krebs, immediately after the pronoun. You can also omit something in a quotation. You would do that merely because of length, not because of content. So you don't want to omit something that's going to change the content. That's unethical. But if there's something that's not necessary, the way you can omit it is using a piece of punctuation called the ellipsis, or 3 periods. You might have seen it as, and you'll see that with the example I give you with the omission. Krebs, comma, quote, during his time, ... or period, was sleeping late in bed, unquote. And then we have in parentheses 162, close parentheses. And I believe, as I had mentioned last class, 2 very great resources that I highly recommend. The first being Purdue Owl, which is a website that was constructed by Purdue University, but they've made it accessible to the public, that reviews the entire writing process. The GCC library as well is another great resource because they have a specific section for writing and citation guides. Keep in mind our textbook as well, that many of the early readings we did talked about the conventions of writing a paper and how to construct a paper and how to document. So all of those are resources that you can use in terms of documentation. But you do want to make sure that you're quoting within the paper. And again, as I believe I had mentioned last class, you don't want to overquote, just insert quotes purely to add length. I'm guesstimating the paper should be 4 to 5 pages long, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to defend your thesis. And that said, you also want to avoid the other extreme, no quotation whatsoever. I often liken someone writing a paper to an attorney that is presenting before a judge. So they're gathering the best evidence to present. And a good attorney can argue either side of the case, even though they might have a preference for one or the other. And obviously, sometimes one side has stronger evidence than another. But a good attorney can put together whatever evidence exists in the best way possible to support a particular position. It's why so many attorneys actually begin as English majors. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about documentation, and I wanted to move forward to start talking about drama. So you know you've handed in a journal about the 3 short stories, which I will be returning to you shortly if I haven't already done so. Hopefully those journals will give you some direction on how you could proceed with writing if you wanted to pursue an idea from your journals and your papers. And if all goes well with our timeline, I should be able to devote some of our class time to have you actually construct your paper. In the interim, we move forward to our next section, and that happens to be drama. And drama is very different than short story. Drama is much longer, which means that we will be spending multiple classes talking about one drama. That said, we will be watching performance as well as reading and discussing drama, because ultimately dramas are meant to be performed. Ideally, we would see them live. That's not going to be a possibility, so we're going to have to see recordings instead. Nevertheless, we've got approximately 2 weeks devoted to each of the 3 dramas we will be reading in our drama section. The first being Oedipus the King, and that's a very old drama, 430 BC, Greece. The second being A Midsummer Night's Dream. That's also a very old drama, though it's certainly newer than Oedipus the King, and that's in the late 1500s in England. And then finally, our third drama, and that happens to be A Raisin in the Sun, written in America in the 1950s. And some suggestions I have for reading drama, because keep in mind that watching a drama is never a substitute for actually reading it. That if we are going to truly appreciate drama from an academic and literary perspective, we need to read it as carefully as we would read short story, despite its length. So that means that we also have multiple classes devoted to the dramas. And I suggest that you try to have the drama read in its entirety at the very beginning of the unit when that drama is first assigned. So as we're talking about it over several classes, you're at home reading the next drama. So what that would mean is that while we're talking about Oedipus the King, my hope is that you are at home reading Midsummer Night's Dream. And when we are talking about Midsummer Night's Dream, my hope is that you are at home reading A Raisin in the Sun. And we are talking about A Raisin in the Sun. No, there won't be another drama for you to read, but by that point, we'll be talking about our second paper and our second journal, which will be devoted to drama. So, as you are now thinking about your first journal on short story and your first paper on short story, I'm beginning to introduce the idea of dramas, and you'll see that I have several readings that are assigned. These I was not able to find online, unfortunately, because of copyright issues, but keep in mind that the text is on reserve in the GCC library in the event that you needed to access it. On page 1094, it talks about some of the elements of drama that you can expect. We are going to get, when we read drama, pure dialogue. So that's going to be very different than all of the short stories that we've read that also has some exposition or background information or description. Because the dramas are longer, we might have multiple plots. They're known as subplots. Usually they're secondary plots, and they support the main plot. And usually we can expect the kind of pyramid structure with rising action, much like you would go up to the point of a pyramid, and then descending action, and then a conclusion. But we can also expect some of the things that we saw in short story: a protagonist, a main character, an antagonist, the antithesis to the protagonist, themes, universal messages or issues, symbols, representations, oftentimes of abstract things in concrete ways, metaphors, the comparison of two dissimilar things without using like or as. If you use like or as, that's a simile. So they give you an example of a couple of dramas, including probably the drama that you have most familiarity with, which is probably watching television. And of course, television is formulaic. It's made to entertain, and it's made to generate profit. That's not to say that literary dramas are not made to entertain or generate profit. In fact, that was Shakespeare, both as the television of his time to entertain, and he made a very nice living as a dramatist. Nevertheless, probably television shows are geared towards mass audiences. And of course, you've got things like cable that might be focused on a particular demographic within an audience. But generally speaking, and that's not to in any way disparage television, because I think that some of the best dramas I've seen have been on television. If you've never seen the series Breaking Bad, I highly encourage you to do it. It really is a modern retelling of Oedipus the King, which we'll talk about when we get to Oedipus the King. It's just superbly done. But they give you an example of a television show that perhaps you may have seen, but you've probably heard of, and it's called Seinfeld. It was quite popular in the 90s, which is probably the height of television. This would be right on the cusp of when the internet came into play. So the internet, of course, changed everything in terms of media because now we can access media through the internet. We don't necessarily have to access media through a particular vehicle. So television can be accessed through the internet. It doesn't necessarily need to be accessed through television, even though we still call it television because that's how we initially accessed it, through that box that would transmit signals. But one of the things that they talk about with this Seinfeld episode is how to go about reading a script. And you definitely want to pay attention to any stage directions. And I know you're going to be tempted to skip them and you want to get straight to the dialogue, but trust me, those are the only hints or clues you have to visualize what's going on in the drama. Or if you were actually putting this on stage, this would be the only information you have as a director in terms of how to stage it. You also want to pay very close attention to the characters. You want to try to visualize what they look like, get to know their names, and separate them from one another in your mind, because you are going to need to pay attention to which character is speaking and when, or else if you're reading just all of the dialogue, it's all going to blend together. And I gave, and you can see this in the notes below, an example from that script that our textbook offers us from Seinfeld. It's a brief little episode. Perhaps you've seen it. It's called The Pitch. And basically, if you don't know anything about Seinfeld, its claim to fame was that it was a show about nothing. So it would talk about trivial things in a comedic way. And this episode, The Pitch, is where the main characters in Seinfeld actually go to a television station to pitch their new idea for a television show, which is about nothing. So you can see how meta this all is. So that's part of the humor of this episode. But the reason why I wanted to draw your attention to it is because reading the episode is quite different than seeing it actually performed. And in this particular instance, I'm just going to read you very briefly just a few of the sentences of dialogue. And Stu says to Jerry, this is in Act 2, Scene G, the NBC President's Office day. And the stage directions are: the mood is jovial. Stu Shermack is there along with Susan Ross and Jake Crespi, Russell Dalrymple, the head of the network. And Stu to Jerry, the bit I really liked was where the parakeet flew into the mirror. Now that's funny. And George said, the parakeet in the mirror, that's a good one, Stu. And Jerry says, yeah, it's one of my favorites. And Russell says, what about you, George? Have you written anything we might know? And George says, well, possibly. I wrote an off-Broadway show, La Cocina. Actually, it was an off-Broadway. It was a comedy about a Mexican chef. And Jerry says, oh, it was very funny. There was a great scene with the chef. What was his name? And George says, Pepe. And Jerry says, oh, Pepe. Yeah, Pepe. And he was making tamales. And Susan says, no, he actually cooked on the stage. And George says, no, he mimed it. And I could go on. Notice how I'm taking the time to tell you who's speaking. Again, you really need to pay attention to the characters speaking. I encourage you to watch the clip below because you will see that episode acted out and it will come alive in a way that reading the script and the way that I just did with you won't and can't. Which is why we want to spend time with performance. But remember that performance is also interpretation. So we've got the initial text that was written by the author, and we've spent a lot of time talking about how there are different ways to interpret an author's text. But now there's yet an additional layer. How do we go about interpreting that particular production? And each production will be different based on the director and based on the actors. So all of those things play a role in terms of our watching a production. And yet we have an additional layer because we aren't watching a live production where we get to decide where to focus our attention. Those spotlights might perhaps help us focus our attention in a particular area or not. But now we've got a camera who's directing our attention. So now we've got camera people in addition to directors, in addition to actors. So it can get quite complex. And we could spend an entire semester just talking about different adaptations of a particular drama. Obviously, we don't have the kind of time to do something like that. But I wanted you to keep that in mind. The elements of a drama, what you're going to find is that drama is divided up into sections, usually into acts. Those are the main divisions of a play. When we get to Shakespeare, we'll talk about how he divided up his drama into 5 acts. And then those acts are divided into scenes. Those are divisions in the act that usually indicate new locations or new characters. And as I had indicated, you'll oftentimes have a subplot, a secondary action to the main plot, but it should all be connected. Stage directions, again, those playwright instructions to the actors that we want to pay very close attention to. And the pyramid structure, the rising and the falling of action. And they give you an example, actually, of a one-act play. It is possible to have a play that's just one act, called Trifles. I don't know if any of you have ever read this play previously. It happens to be about a familiar subject that we've discussed earlier, about how women oftentimes aren't given acknowledgement or voice or agency in society. And one of the things about this particular drama is that you can go through it the way you would with a piece of literature and identify things that seem to be important. In fact, there are a series of questions for you to consider when you are reading and writing drama that appears, or writing about drama, that appears on page 1115. The first question is one of my favorites. Did you enjoy the drama? I notice it's also called a play because of play acting. It's supposed to be fun. Much like play is supposed to be fun. What specifically pleased or displeased you? Number 2, what's the significance of the play's title? We've talked about that in terms of short story. 3, what information do the stage directions provide about the characters, the action, the setting? Number 4, how is the exposition or background information revealed? Number 5, in what ways is the setting important? We've talked about that as well in terms of short story. Number 6, are there foreshadowings or clues as to what will be happening? We've talked about that as well with short story. Number 7, what is the major conflict or the issue that needs to be addressed? And it may or may not be addressed by the ending. We've talked about that as well in short story. Is there one plot or are there subplots? With a short story, you usually have one plot because it's short. If you're reading a novel, it could have subplots, and certainly with dramas, we'll have subplots. Who or what is the protagonist? Who or what is the antagonist? By what means does the playwright reveal information about characters? Keep in mind how tricky it is to know what a character is thinking. It's easier in, let's say, a short story because an author can write he thought. But if this is completely dialogue driven, the author is going to need to find a different way to let us know what a character is thinking, whether they think their thoughts out loud or whether there's a voiceover. There could be lots of different ways to do it. What is the purpose of the minor characters? That's a question we've asked ourselves as well with short story. Do all the characters use the same kind of language, or is their speech differentiated, and if so, why? That was also a question we asked ourselves with short story. Does your response to the characters change over the course of the text? That too we asked with short stories. Are there words or images repeated in the drama that take on special meanings, much like we saw with short story? What is the tone of the play? Is it light, humorous, relaxed, sad, angry, intense, violent? We've also talked about tone with short story. Are there symbols used in the play? Things that have more than just a literal meaning. We've talked about that with short story. Are there any unfamiliar theatrical conventions that might perhaps present challenges to you understanding the play? This is going to be important because ultimately where the play is performed dictates how the play is written, which means we need to spend some time talking about the theaters of the time when the play was written, because ultimately there were some things you could or could not do based on the advancements of the theater and the technology of the time. Is the theme stated directly or is it suggested implicitly? It'll probably be suggested implicitly, as we've learned with literature. Usually you have to work for the interpretation. Does the play reflect the values of the society in which it's set, in which it was written? Or does it question those values? How does the play reflect or perhaps challenge your own values? Is there a recording that you can watch? And as I indicated, I'm going to devote some class time to allowing you to watch a performance. Keep in mind that is no substitute for reading. That's a supplement to. How about question 23? How would you produce this play if you were putting it on stage? Or 24, is there a particular critical approach that seems especially appropriate for this drama? Remember, this is how we began the semester, talking about critical approaches. How might biographical information about the author help the reader to grasp the central concerns of the play? How might historical information about the play provide a useful context for interpretation? To what extent do your own experiences, values, beliefs, and assumptions inform your interpretation about the play? What kinds of evidence from the play are you focusing on? And given that there are a variety of ways to interpret the play, which one seems to be the most useful to you and why? And you can see that you even have an example of a student paper on page, or shortly after this, so I think it's on page 1117, that talks about the feminist evidence in Susan Glaspell's Trifles, that one-act play that I was referencing earlier that's included in your textbook, that they use as an example of how one could go about interpreting a drama. That you've got a reader who's gone through and taken notes about things that might seem significant. Sorry about that. I guess you can hear my phone in the background. But at any rate, okay, so I will take care of that after I'm done recording. Again, my apologies. But that's what happens when you record at home. But what I wanted to draw your attention to was the annotated section of the play Trifles that is included in your textbook, page 1091, where you've had a reader go through and they've identified things that are important, whether it be a character's name, whether it be a symbol, whether it be just the title itself. Trifles means things that are not very important. The plot of the play basically is that there's a mystery that needs to be solved, and we're given the scene initially. This play was written in 1916, keep that in mind. The kitchen in the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright, a gloomy kitchen, was left without having been put in order. Unwashed pans under the sink, this is on page 1080. A loaf of bread outside the bread box, a dish towel on the table, other signs of incompleted work. And it goes on and it talks a little bit about the disheveled state of the kitchen. Of course, we would see all of that if we were watching the performance, but now we have to read it and envision this. And that setting is suggestive that something went wrong, or else things wouldn't be that disheveled. And then our first piece of dialogue is from the county attorney, who's rubbing his hands saying, "This feels good. Come up to the fire, ladies." And then Mrs. Peters is the next character who, after taking a step forward, says, "I'm not cold." And then the sheriff, unbuttoning his overcoat and stepping away from the stove as if to mark the beginning of official business, asks, "Now, Mr. Hale, before we move things about, you explain to Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning." As they continue on, they find out that there was a murder. As the men go to investigate the murder, the women are left to their own devices. The women actually figure out what happened in the murder. It turns out that the wife has killed her husband. It's an episode of domestic violence. He had been abusing her, so now she killed him after he killed the thing that she loved most, which happened to be her pet bird. The way the women figure all of this out are through trifles, little seemingly meaningless details in the home that they put together as clues. And once they figure this out, they have a decision to make. Do they tell the male authorities that they were accompanying what they've discovered, or do they keep it to themselves? And they decide to keep it to themselves, that if the others can't figure it out, that perhaps this is the way justice is supposed to be enacted. And again, it's not a moral statement about what's right or what's wrong. It's more a question of the kind of agency or lack of agency female would have during this time period. So it's a great little one-act play that they actually even turn into a short story in your textbook. So you can see the difference between a drama, which is dialogue-based, and a short story, which has a lot of description. So That's all that I really wanted to talk about in terms of drama at this point. Next class, I wanted to talk a little bit about Sophocles and Oedipus the King. Our last attendance question was asking you to consider what you thought you might write your first drama about. And my question for this class is, do you have any questions about paper number 1, now that I've talked a little bit about topics and the construction of writing a paper? If you don't, just say no, and that basically will satisfy your attendance for the class. But if you do, this is one of your opportunities to ask questions. As I indicated, you don't need to read the responses from your classmates, but you do, or you're not required to respond, I'm sorry, to the responses of your classmates, but you are required to read the responses of your classmates as well as my responses in turn. That'll duplicate what we would have talked about in class, so it would have been our class discussion. So hearing some of your classmates' questions might help satisfy or answer some of your own questions, and my responses might also give you further direction. So do make sure that you do that. So at this point, I will leave you to answering our attendance question. We will continue on with drama and also talking about the paper next class. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.